The golden rays of early September sunlight filtered softly through the stained glass windows of Jonathan Everett's spacious office, playing on the spines of ancient books and casting intricate shadows on the antique mahogany desk. Jonathan, a 47-year-old man with piercing gray eyes and a hint of gray at the temples, stood by the window, gazing thoughtfully at the immaculately manicured lawns of his estate in the exclusive Oakwood Heights neighborhood of Boston. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored Brioni suit, which only emphasized his status as one of the most influential businessmen in New England. Today, however, even his perfectly chosen wardrobe could not hide the tension reflected in his usually confident gaze. Jonathan Everett, heir to a multi-million-dollar fortune and CEO of Everett Industries, an empire spanning everything from high technology to real estate, was about to make the most important and perhaps riskiest decision of his life. A decision that could change not only his fate, but also the future of his entire family. A light knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Jonathan said, not taking his eyes off the window. Victoria, his wife of 20 years, entered the office. At 45, she looked flawless. An elegant Chanel dress emphasized her slender figure, and her chestnut hair, styled in an intricate hairstyle, framed a face on which the years had left only barely noticeable traces. Victoria was known not only as Jonathan Everett's wife, but also as a successful philanthropist, heading several charitable foundations. "Jonathan, dear, are you sure you want to do this?" she asked, approaching her husband. There was concern in her voice, mixed with slight bewilderment. Jonathan turned to his wife, a small smile appearing on his face. "Victoria, we have already discussed this. I need to know what is happening with our children. Something is wrong, and we will not find out by the usual methods." Victoria sighed, sitting down in a leather chair by the fireplace. "I understand your concern, but don't you think that disguising yourself as a teacher is too much?" Jonathan walked over to the table and picked up a photograph in a silver frame. It depicted their children, 16-year-old Alexander and 14-year-old Sophia. The picture was taken last summer during a family holiday in the Maldives. The children were smiling, their faces glowing with happiness and carefreeness. How everything had changed in this past year, Jonathan thought. "Look at them, Victoria," he said, handing the photograph to his wife. "Remember what they were like? Alexander, always first in class, captain of the school debate team, and Sophia, our little pianist, winner of all the music competitions. And now? Alexander is skipping classes, his grades have dropped, and the principal is hinting at some kind of discipline problem. Sophia has abandoned music, sits in her room for hours. They are distancing themselves from us, Victoria, and I have to know why." Victoria looked closely at the photograph and her eyes filled with tears. "You're right, Jonathan. But how do you explain your absence from the company? Everett Industries cannot remain without leadership indefinitely." Jonathan returned to his desk and sat down in his chair. "I've thought it all out. Officially, I'm going on an extended trip to Japan to negotiate a merger with Tokyo Tech. Mark Donovan will be acting CEO in my absence. He'll handle it." "What about the board? Won't they suspect something is wrong?" "I talked to the chairman, old George Huntington. He's the only one who knows the truth. George understands the importance of family. He'll support me." Victoria stood up and walked over to her husband, putting her hand on his shoulder. "I still think it's risky, but I trust you, Jonathan. If you think this is the only way to help our children, I'll support you." Jonathan covered her hand with his. "Thank you, dear. I know this is hard for you, but believe me, I have to do this." At that moment, there was another knock on the door. This time it was Alfred, the Everett family butler for over 30 years. "Excuse me, sir, madam," he said in his usual calm tone. "Mr. Reynolds has arrived and is awaiting you in the drawing room." Jonathan nodded. Thank you, Alfred. We will be down in a moment. When the butler had left, Jonathan turned to his wife. This is Daniel Reynolds, an old friend of mine from college. He now works for the FBI in the cybercrime unit. He will help me with the documents and the legend. Victoria looked at her husband in surprise. You involve the FBI? Jonathan shook his head. No, this is a personal favor. Daniel is doing it unofficially as a friend. He will create for me an impeccable identity as a history teacher. James Baker, a Princeton graduate with 15 years of teaching experience in private schools. No one will suspect a catch. Jonathan. Victoria looked carefully into her husband's eyes. Are you really willing to do this? Live a double life? Lie to our children? Jonathan took a deep breath. I know it sounds terrible, but believe me, I'm doing this for them. There's something going on in their lives, something serious. And if the only way I can find out the truth is to become a part of their school life, I'm willing to do it. Victoria nodded, though her eyes were still doubtful. Okay, dear, let's go down to your friend. They left the study and headed up the wide marble staircase to the first-floor sitting room. As they passed Sophia's room, Jonathan heard the faint sounds of music. His daughter had locked herself in her room again, as she often did lately. Alexander's room was empty. Most likely, he was somewhere again with new friends that he had not told his parents about. Daniel Reynolds was waiting for them in the sitting room, a tall man with short graying hair and an attentive gaze that betrayed his profession. He stood up as Jonathan and Victoria entered the room. Jonathan, Victoria, it's good to see you, he said, shaking Jonathan's hand and nodding slightly to Victoria. Thank you for coming, Dan, Jonathan replied. Please sit down. Once everyone was seated, Daniel opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder of documents. So, Jonathan, here's your new identity, he began, handing over the folder. James Edward Baker, born March 28, 1976, in Providence, Rhode Island. Graduate of the Princeton University History Department with a master's degree in American history. Has taught in private schools in New England for the past 15 years. Jonathan opened the folder and began flipping through the documents. It was all there. A birth certificate, a diploma, an employment history, even a credit history. That's impressive, Dan, Jonathan said. How did you manage to create such a detailed history? Daniel smiled slightly. It's best if you don't know the details, my friend. Let's just say I have connections in the right places. The main thing is that this identity will stand up to any scrutiny. Even if someone decides to dig deeper, they'll find real records of James Baker in all the relevant databases. Victoria, sitting next to her husband, looked worried. Is this legal, Mr. Reynolds? Daniel looked at her seriously. Mrs. Everett, I understand your concerns. What we are doing is in a gray area of the law, but I assure you that every precaution has been taken. This operation will not harm anyone, except perhaps those who truly pose a threat to your children. Jonathan placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. Victoria, I know this is hard to accept, but believe me, if there is even the slightest chance that our children are in danger, we must do everything we can to protect them. Victoria nodded slowly. I understand. Just be careful, okay? Of course, dear, Jonathan replied, then turned to Daniel. What now, Dan? Daniel pulled another envelope from his briefcase. Here is your new wardrobe, Jonathan. Forget Brioni suits and Patek Philippe watches. James Baker is a modest history teacher. Your new look is tweed jackets with elbow patches, plain shirts, and an inexpensive watch. I have also prepared for you a pair of glasses with plain lenses. They will change your appearance a little. Jonathan took the envelope and looked inside. There were photographs of the clothes and accessories that were now to become his new style. It will be unusual, he said with a slight smile. Of course, Daniel replied, but it is necessary. You must fully inhabit the role. No one must suspect that you are not who you say you are. What about a place to live? Victoria asked. Jonathan can't live here. It would arouse suspicion. Daniel nodded. We've already worked that out. We've rented a small apartment in the area where teachers usually live. The address and keys are in this envelope. He handed another envelope to Jonathan. Jonathan took the envelope and thought for a moment. The reality of his plan was beginning to hit him like never before. He would be living a double life, away from his family, away from the comforts of home, away from everything he knew and loved. But for the sake of his children, he was willing to do it. "Thank you, Dan," Jonathan said, looking up at his friend. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Daniel nodded. "I understand, Jonathan. Just remember, you're venturing into dangerous territory. One wrong move and your cover could be blown. Be careful and stay in character at all times." "What about the job?" Victoria asked. "How will Jonathan get into our children's school?" "That has been taken care of as well," Daniel replied. "I have contacted the school principal, Thomas Gray, under the guise of a reference. James Baker has been officially hired as a history teacher. Your first day is next Monday, Jonathan." Jonathan nodded, his pulse quickening. This was all getting real, and there was little time left to prepare. "There's one more thing," Daniel continued, pulling a small wristwatch-like device from his briefcase. "This is a special communication device. It's disguised as an ordinary watch, but will allow you to contact me securely if necessary. Simply press the button on the side 3 times and I will receive a signal. Only use it as a last resort." Jonathan took the device and examined it carefully. "I hope I don't need it," he said quietly. "I hope so too," Daniel replied. "But it's best to be prepared for anything." Victoria, who had remained silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "What if the children recognize Jonathan? They're his own children. How could he hide from them?" Daniel smiled. "Don't worry, Mrs. Everett. It's amazing how little it takes to change a person's appearance beyond recognition. Glasses, a different hairstyle, maybe a little goatee. Even his own children might not recognize their father, especially if they don't expect him to be a teacher." Jonathan looked at his wife. "Victoria, I know this is difficult, but believe me, I'll do my best to remain unrecognized and still find out what's going on with our children." Victoria took a deep breath. "I trust you, Jonathan. Just be careful. And remember, no matter what you find out, we're still family. We will get through this together." Jonathan squeezed his wife's hand. "I promise, honey, no matter what happens, we'll still be a family." Daniel stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "Jonathan, you have 4 days until your new job starts. Use this time to prepare. Learn your cover story, get used to your new clothes, practice talking like a history teacher. And remember, you're not a millionaire CEO anymore. You're a humble teacher living paycheck to paycheck." Jonathan nodded, standing after his friend. "Thank you, Dan, for everything." After Daniel left, Jonathan and Victoria sat in the living room staring at each other in silence. Finally, Victoria broke the silence. "Are you sure this is the only way?" Jonathan walked to the window, looking out at the driveway where Daniel's car was driving away. "I don't know if it is the only way, but it's the best I can come up with. We've tried talking to them, we've hired psychologists, we've even tried following them. Nothing has worked. They've closed themselves off to us, Victoria, and I have to find out why." Victoria walked up to her husband and hugged him from behind. "I understand. It's just, I'm going to miss you." Jonathan turned and hugged his wife. "I'm going to miss you too, honey, but it won't be for long. As soon as I figure out what's going on, I'll come back and we'll fix it." At that moment, the front door slammed loudly and quick footsteps were heard in the hall. Jonathan and Victoria emerged from the living room just in time to see Alexander run past them toward the stairs. "Alex," Victoria called. "Where have you been? We were worried." Alexander stopped halfway up the stairs and turned around. His eyes were red as if he hadn't slept for days. "Just hanging out with friends, Mom. Nothing special." "Son," Jonathan began, taking a step forward. "Can we talk?" Alexander shook his head. "Not now, Dad. I'm tired. Maybe later." And before his parents could say anything, he ran up the stairs and disappeared into his room. A few seconds later, they heard the door slam. Jonathan and Victoria exchanged glances. Both concern and determination were evident in their eyes. "Do you see it now?" Jonathan said quietly. "Something is happening to our son, and I need to find out what it is." Victoria nodded. "You're right. Do what you have to do, but be careful." Jonathan wrapped his arms around his wife again, holding her tightly. A difficult and dangerous adventure lay ahead of him. He knew he was risking a lot: his reputation, his relationship with his children, maybe even his freedom. But for his family, he was ready to do anything. Jonathan walked up to his office, sat down at his desk, and opened the folder with the documents of his new identity. James Edward Baker, a history teacher. This role would now be his life for the near future. He picked up a pen and began to take notes, preparing for his new role. History had always been his passion, and now this passion would help him save his family. Dusk was gathering outside the window, and the first stars were appearing in the sky. Jonathan Everett, millionaire and head of a large corporation, was preparing to disappear. In his place was to come James Baker, a modest history teacher. And somewhere deep inside, Jonathan knew that this adventure would change not only the lives of his children, but his own. Forever. Monday, September 6th, was a surprisingly cool day for early fall. Jonathan Everett, now James Baker, stood in front of the mirror in his small rented apartment in a quiet Boston neighborhood. He barely recognized himself. A tweed jacket with leather elbow patches, a plain white shirt, a modest tie, and wire-rimmed glasses completely changed his appearance. The light stubble he had grown in recent days completed the image of a typical history teacher. "You can do this," he told his reflection, sighing deeply. Outside the house, Jonathan, now James, got into the nondescript used Ford Focus that Daniel had prepared for him as part of his cover. It was strange to drive such a modest car after his collection of luxury cars, but this was part of his new life. Approaching Oakwood Academy, James felt his heartbeat quicken. The school was an imposing neo-Gothic building surrounded by manicured lawns and old oak trees. Parking in the faculty lot, he closed his eyes for a moment, collecting his thoughts. "Mr. Baker?" a voice called from next to the car. James opened his eyes to see a tall, middle-aged man with graying hair and a friendly smile. "Yes, it's me," James replied, getting out of the car. "Welcome to Oakwood Academy. I am Thomas Gray, the headmaster." The man extended his hand in greeting. James shook the outstretched hand, trying not to show his nervousness. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Gray. Thank you for the opportunity to work at your school. Please call me Thomas. Come, I will show you the school and your office." Following the headmaster through the corridors of the school, James looked around carefully, memorizing the layout of the classrooms and offices. They passed a group of seniors, among whom James noticed his son, Alexander. His heart skipped a beat, but he kept an impassive expression on his face. "And here is your office, Mr. Baker," Thomas said, opening the door to a spacious room with large windows. "I hope you will be comfortable here." "Thank you. It looks great," James replied, examining his new workplace. "Your first lesson is in an hour with the 10th grade. Good luck to you." With these words, Thomas Gray left, leaving James alone in the office. James sat down at his desk and pulled out his notes. He had prepared carefully for this day, studying the curriculum and teaching methods. Now he was going to put his preparation to the test. When the bell rang, James took a deep breath and headed to the classroom. As he entered, he found 25 pairs of eyes focused on him. His daughter, Sophia, was among the students. She was sitting in the back row, lost in thought. "Good morning, class," James began, trying to sound confident. "My name is Mr. Baker, and I will be your new history teacher." He began the lesson with a brief introduction to the American history course they would be taking that year. To his surprise, the teaching went quite smoothly. Years of presenting to boards of directors and investors were proving unexpectedly useful in his role as a teacher. After the lesson, as the students were leaving the classroom, James noticed that Sophia had lingered behind. She was slowly gathering her things, clearly in no hurry to leave. "Sophia, right?" James asked her, trying to keep his voice neutral. The girl looked up, and James had a hard time keeping his emotions in check. There was a longing in her gaze that he hadn't noticed before. "Yes, Mr. Baker," she answered quietly. "How was your first lesson? I hope you weren't too bored?" Sophia smiled slightly, and it was the first genuine smile James had seen on her face in weeks. "No, not at all. I enjoyed it." "I'm glad to hear it. If you have any questions or just want to discuss anything on the subject, my door is always open." Sophia nodded and left the classroom. James watched her go, feeling both relieved and worried. Something was clearly bothering his daughter, and he was determined to find out what it was. The next few days followed a similar rhythm, with James teaching, observing students, and trying to gather as much information as he could about his children's lives at school. On Wednesday, during lunch, he witnessed an unpleasant scene in the school cafeteria. A group of girls, including one Emily Donovan, the daughter of the vice president of Everett Industries, were clearly bullying Sophia. James barely restrained himself from intervening, but he knew that this would arouse suspicion. That evening, sitting in his rented apartment, James recorded his observations in an encrypted file on his laptop. Day 3. Sophia seems to be the target of bullying by a group of popular girls. I need to get to the bottom of this and find a way to help without arousing suspicion. Alexander is still keeping to himself, interacting mainly with a group of upperclassmen whom I have not yet identified. I will try to establish contact with him in class tomorrow. On Thursday, James taught his first lesson in Alexander's class. His son sat in the middle of the room, staring blankly out the window. When James asked a question about the causes of the Civil War, Alexander suddenly raised his hand and gave a comprehensive answer that surprised even James. After the lesson, he asked Alexander to stay behind. "Great answer today, Alexander," James said. "You seem to have a good grasp of history." Alexander shrugged. "I just read a lot, Mr. Baker." "That's commendable. You know, we have a history club at school. Maybe you'd be interested in joining." Alexander's eyes briefly flickered with interest, but it quickly faded. "Thank you, but I don't have time for clubs." James nodded, not wanting to push. "I understand, but if you change your mind, let me know." As Alexander left, James felt a renewed sense of unease. Something was clearly bothering his son, and it had nothing to do with his studies. By the end of the first week, James had begun to form a general picture of what was happening at school. Sophia was being bullied, but the reasons for this remained unclear. Alexander, despite his abilities, seemed to be deliberately distancing himself from his studies and school life. On Friday evening, while sitting in the staff room, grading his students' first essays, James overheard a conversation between two teachers. "Have you heard? They say there's a drug problem at school again," said the math teacher, Miss Parker. "Again? I thought things had died down after last year's scandal," replied the English teacher, Mrs. Collins. James tensed, trying not to miss a word. "An anonymous source has informed the administration that some of the seniors are distributing some new synthetic drugs. Principal Gray is keeping it under wraps for now, but the police have already launched an investigation." James felt a chill run down his spine. Could this have anything to do with Alexander's changes in behavior? Back home, he lay awake for a long time, thinking about everything he had learned that week. He was sure that he was on the verge of uncovering something serious, but along with it came the realization that his mission could be much more dangerous than he had originally imagined. Before going to bed, James sent a coded message to Daniel. Week 1 completed. Progress made, but also new questions. May need your help soon. Stay in touch. As James drifted off to sleep, he thought about his children, the secrets the school held, and how far he would go to protect his family. One thing he knew for sure: this was just the beginning. Monday of the second week began with an unexpected encounter for James Baker. Entering the staff room, he ran into Victoria, his wife, who had come to the school under the pretext of discussing the children's progress. "Welcome, Mrs. Everett," said Principal Gray, who was just leaving his office. "Baker, could you spare a moment of your time for Mrs. Everett? She would like to discuss Sophia's progress in your class." James nodded, trying to remain unperturbed. "Of course, I would be happy to." Finding themselves alone in his office, Victoria whispered, "Jonathan, I couldn't wait any longer. What did you find out?" James quickly looked around, making sure no one was eavesdropping. "Victoria, the situation is more complicated than we thought. Sophia is being bullied, and Alexander, I suspect he may be connected to drug trafficking at school." Victoria went pale. "Oh my God, what should we do?" "Nothing yet. I need to gather more information. Act as usual and don't let on that anything is wrong." After Victoria left, James felt a new surge of determination. He had to act faster. The next day, during a lesson in Sophia's class, James decided to lead a discussion on the topic of social pressure and bullying in schools. He noticed how Sophia tensed up when the topic of cyberbullying came up. After the lesson, he approached her. "Sophia, I notice that this topic has bothered you. If you need someone to talk to, I'm always here to listen." Sophia hesitated, then quietly said, "Thank you, Mr. Baker. Maybe I can come see you later." James nodded, his heart aching for his daughter. On Wednesday, James had seen Alexander sneak something to another student in the hallway. He had decided to follow the student and found him meeting with a group of other seniors behind the gym. They were exchanging small packages. James took some photos on his phone and sent them to Daniel, asking him to analyze them. On Thursday, Sophia came to his office after school. With tears in her eyes, she told him how a group of girls led by Emily Donovan had been bullying her on social media, spreading false rumors and altered photos. "I don't know what to do, Mr. Baker. I've tried to ignore them, but they're only getting worse," Sophia sobbed. James resisted the urge to hug his daughter. Instead, he said, "Sophia, what you told me is serious. We need to tell the school. You shouldn't have to suffer alone." Sophia nodded, wiping away her tears. "Thank you, Mr. Baker. You're the first adult I've ever met who actually listened to me." The words pierced James's heart like a knife. On Friday, Daniel's reply arrived. Analysis of the photographs confirmed the worst fears. The pictures showed deals involving a new type of synthetic drug known as Lucifer. These drugs were especially dangerous because of their highly addictive properties and severe side effects. The beginning of the third week was marked by an unexpected turn of events. On Monday morning, Principal Gray called an emergency meeting of the teachers. "We have an emergency situation," he began in a somber tone. "One of our students, Michael Thompson, has been hospitalized after overdosing on an unknown drug. The police are launching an investigation, and we need the full cooperation of every one of you." James felt a chill run down his spine. He knew Michael. He was one of Alexander's friends. After the meeting, James decided to act decisively. He approached Principal Gray. "Sir, I would like to offer my assistance in the investigation. I have some experience working with difficult teenagers, and I think I might be able to help identify the source of the problem." Gray looked at him carefully. "I appreciate your initiative, Mr. Baker, but be careful. This situation may be more dangerous than it seems." On Tuesday, James noticed that Alexander seemed especially nervous. After class, he asked him to stay late. "Alexander, I know we haven't known each other for long, but I can see that something is bothering you. If you need help, you can come to me." Alexander was silent for a long time, then said, "Mr. Baker, sometimes mistakes become too big to fix." "There are no mistakes that can't be fixed, Alexander. The main thing is not to be afraid to ask for help." Alexander nodded and quickly left the classroom, leaving James deep in thought. On Wednesday, Sophia came to James with good news. After his intervention, the school administration had launched an investigation into the cyberbullying. Emily Donovan and her friends had been called to the principal's office, and the bullying seemed to have stopped. "Thank you, Mr. Baker," Sophia said with a genuine smile. "You have no idea how much this means to me." James felt both happy and sad. He had helped his daughter, but as a father, not a teacher. On Thursday, James received an alarming text from Daniel. "Be careful. There is information that a large syndicate is behind the distribution of Lucifer. They may have connections at the school." The news made James tense up. He realized that the situation was much more serious than he had initially thought. On Friday, an event occurred that changed the course of the investigation. After school, James noticed Alexander arguing with the gym teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, behind the gym. The conversation seemed tense, and at one point Rodriguez grabbed Alexander by the arm. James immediately intervened. "What's going on here?" Rodriguez quickly released Alexander. "Nothing, Mr. Baker. Just a little misunderstanding." Alexander looked scared. He took a quick look at James and ran away. James decided to follow Rodriguez. He saw him meet a man in the parking lot and hand him an envelope. That evening, sitting in his apartment, James analyzed the events of the last 2 weeks. He began to understand that there was a drug distribution network operating at the school, and Alexander had somehow become involved in it. But what role did Mr. Rodriguez play in all this? James sent a coded message to Daniel. "Need information on Carlos Rodriguez, the gym teacher at Oakwood Academy. Possible syndicate connection." As James drifted off to sleep, he felt himself getting closer to the solution. But he also knew that the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous his mission became. He had to tread carefully to not only uncover the truth, but also to protect his children. Week 4 began with disturbing news. James received a coded message from Daniel. "Carlos Rodriguez has a criminal record. Suspected of drug cartel ties, but no evidence was found. Use extreme caution." At the morning meeting, Principal Gray announced that the school would be undergoing surprise drug tests. James noticed how tense Alexander was when he heard the news. After school, James decided to talk to his son. "Alexander, I can see that something is bothering you. You can trust me." Alexander hesitated, but then said quietly, "Mr. Baker, I'm in trouble, but I can't talk about it. They're threatening my family." James spent a sleepless night thinking about his son's words. In the morning, he sent Daniel a request to increase security for Victoria and the children, without revealing the true reasons. At school, James noticed that Mr. Rodriguez was acting nervous. During lunch, he overheard Rodriguez talking on the phone. "The shipment will be delivered on Friday. Make sure everything is clear." Sophia came to James in tears. "Mr. Baker, I'm worried about Alex. He's been acting strange. He's hardly home." James reassured his daughter, feeling his heart squeeze from the impossibility of revealing his true identity. Later, he saw Alexander secretly meeting with Mr. Rodriguez behind the gym. The conversation seemed tense, and James noticed Rodriguez handing Alexander a package. James decided to act. He set up a hidden camera in the gym, suspecting that drugs were being exchanged there. That evening, he received a text from Daniel. Police ready for operation. Need irrefutable evidence. Be ready by Friday. Friday morning started out as usual, but James could feel the tension in the air. During recess, he noticed Alexander looking around nervously in the hallway. Suddenly, a scream was heard from the bathroom. James rushed there and saw a student lying on the floor convulsing, clear signs of an overdose. While paramedics were treating the student, James noticed Rodriguez quickly heading toward the gym. He followed him. In the gym, James witnessed a shocking scene. Rodriguez was screaming at Alexander, "You idiot! You almost blew the whole operation!" Alexander, pale and scared, tried to justify himself. "I didn't know he would take that much. I was just following your orders." James could not hold back any longer. He came out of hiding. "Stop this right now." Rodriguez turned around abruptly, drawing his gun. "Who the hell are you?" At that moment, James knew it was time to reveal his true identity. "I'm Jonathan Everett, Alexander's father, and I'm here to put an end to your criminal activity." Alexander looked at his father in shock. "Dad? But how?" Rodriguez, realizing that he was cornered, pointed the gun at Alexander. "One step, and your son will die." James slowly raised his hands. "Think, Rodriguez. The building is surrounded by police. You have no way out." At that moment, a squad of police, led by Daniel Reynolds, burst into the hall. "FBI! Everyone on the floor!" Rodriguez, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, dropped the gun and surrendered. Alexander, still in shock, approached his father. "Dad, I'm so guilty. They threatened to harm Sophia if I didn't help them distribute drugs at school." Jonathan hugged his son. "It's okay, son. It's over now." Daniel walked up to them. "Jonathan, you did a great job. We busted the whole network. Rodriguez was just the tip of the iceberg. There was a whole drug cartel behind him." At that moment, Sophia ran into the room, followed by Victoria. They froze in amazement when they saw Jonathan as a teacher. "Dad?" Sophia whispered. Jonathan looked at his family. "I'm sorry I had to lie to you, but I had to find out the truth and protect you." Victoria walked up to her husband and hugged him tightly. "You're crazy, but I'm proud of you." While the police were finishing up the operation, the Everett family stood hugging each other in the middle of the gym. They knew that there were many difficult conversations and trust to be rebuilt, but the main thing was that they were together again, and secrets no longer separated them. Jonathan looked at his children and wife and realized that, despite all the risks, his decision to become an undercover teacher was the right one. Not only had he uncovered a criminal network, but he had also saved his family, restoring what was truly important: love and trust in each other. In the days following, the dramatic events at Oakwood Gym Academy was in full swing. The police and the FBI had launched a massive operation, arresting not only Carlos Rodriguez but several other members of the ring, including 2 high school students and a school administrator. Jonathan Everett, now out in the open, was forced to testify before the police and the school board. His actions, while unusual, were deemed justified in light of the crime solved. The Everett family entered a period of healing and rethinking. Alexander, freed from the pressure of criminals, completed a course of rehabilitation. He became more open with his parents and began to actively participate in programs to prevent drug use among teenagers. Sophia, having overcome bullying, gained new self-confidence. She resumed her music lessons and even organized a support group for victims of bullying at school. Victoria, impressed by her husband's dedication, decided to devote more time to her family. She reduced her social activities and focused on strengthening family ties. Jonathan, returning to the role of CEO of Everett Industries, made significant changes in his approach to managing the company and his family. He established a more flexible work schedule, allowing him to spend more time with his children, and initiated a number of corporate programs to support youth and combat drug addiction. The school underwent significant changes. Principal Thomas Gray, although not involved in criminal activity, resigned, taking responsibility for what happened under his leadership. The new school administration introduced strict measures to prevent the spread of drugs and combat bullying. Regular meetings with parents, psychological consultations for students, and additional training for teachers were organized. The story of Jonathan Everett, a millionaire who became an undercover teacher to save his children, received wide media coverage. This sparked a public debate about the problems of modern education, parent-child relationships, and the role of wealthy people in solving social problems. Many parents, inspired by Jonathan's example, began to pay more attention to their children's school life. Some large companies followed the example of Everett Industries, launching programs to support youth and combat drug addiction. For Jonathan, the experience of working as a teacher was a turning point in his life. He realized how important it is to be involved in the lives of his children and how much he was missing out on by immersing himself entirely in work. He decided to regularly teach history as a volunteer in various schools, sharing his experience and knowledge with the younger generation. This decision not only enriched his life, but also helped him reconnect with his own children. A year later, the Everett family gathered for a barbecue in their garden. Alexander, now a college student studying social work, talked about his plans to start a foundation to help teenagers in difficult situations. Sophia, preparing for her senior year, shared the success of her band and her plans for the future. Jonathan and Victoria, watching their children, exchanged knowing glances. They had been through a lot, but now their family was stronger than ever. "You know," Jonathan said, hugging his wife, "I never thought that the most important lesson in my life would be the one I learned while pretending to be a teacher." Victoria smiled. "Sometimes we have to lose ourselves to really find what's important." As the sun began to set, casting a warm evening light over the garden, the Everett family gathered for a photo. They had genuine smiles on their faces, a symbol of the difficulties they had overcome and the happiness they had found. This was no longer just the family of a successful businessman. This was a family that had been through trials, realized the value of each member, and was ready to face any future challenges together.